best actors, directors, and screenwriters receive Oscars. The top scientists get Nobel Prizes. Society doles out a multitude of awards every year to celebrate creative achievements. And such events feed a popular conception that creativity is a gift that only certain people possess, and that it is the height of individuality. As Albert Einstein once observed, everything that is really great and inspiring is created by the individual who can labor in freedom. In these terms, the constraints of groups and of mainstream society are often thought to kill creativity. Many see the notion of group creativity as an oxymoron. But let's think creatively here and challenge the basic assumption that the individual creator is the only critical component of the creative process. Let's consider the possibility that groups play an essential role in creativity, not only in generating and shaping novel things, but also in ensuring their appreciation and their impact. Although this idea might seem preposterous, it has garnered significant scientific support. S. Alexander Haslam, Immaculata Adarve-Giorno, Tom Postmus, and Lisa Jans reviewed the accumulated data in an article summarizing the current thinking about groups and creativity. They concluded that it is problematic and unhelpful to separate the creativity of individual minds from the communities in which they flourish. There's a romantic notion that innovation is achieved by rugged individuals working in splendid isolation. But research on personality has found no way to accurately forecast creative behavior. Scholars have scoured the biographies of creative geniuses to find experiences and character traits likely to have contributed to their greatness. Yet they have failed to identify characteristics that predict which young people will go on to become creative geniuses. These efforts lack predictive power because they do not take into account the important role that social context plays. The nature and significance of innovation depend on the interaction between a person's ideas and the time and culture in which he or she lives. If Dolly Parton had been born in 1746 rather than 1946, we would have been unlikely to ever hear Jolene. Likewise, if Italian composer Domenico Cimarosa had been born in 1949 rather than 1749, his nearly 80 operas, including the masterpiece Il Matrimonio Segreto, probably would not have seen the light of day. Such examples speak more generally to the influence that groups exert on creativity. In the 1970s, psychologists Henry Tajfel and John Turner of the University of Bristol in England developed the concept of social identity, observing that across a range of contexts, people understand themselves not only as individuals, but also as members of the groups they belong to. So a Cubist painter, we'll call him Pablo, may sometimes think of himself in terms of his personal identity, Pablo, but on other occasions, he will understand himself as a Cubist, his social identity. In yet other situations, his social identity might be defined with reference to his nationality, his gender, religion, or to his role in a specific team or club or organization. Tajfel and Turner argued that when a particular social identity is psychologically salient, such that it determines a person's sense of who he or she is, the group that is the basis for that identity will exert a profound influence on that person's behavior. Furthermore, the way in which that person evaluates an action will reflect shared understandings of that group. This idea also applies to creative behavior and its evaluation. For example, as a Cubist, Pablo is more likely to be interested in and to appreciate abstract representations of objects, and he will be more likely to paint in accordance with Cubist sensibilities and preferences. Social identities also grant people a shared perspective, as well as the ability and motivation to engage in mutual social influence. But when people act in terms of their unique personal identity, they are likely to display creativity by deviating from that norm. In an experiment that S. Alexander Haslam, Immaculata Adarves-Yorno, and Tom Postmas conducted, they asked some college students who were working in groups to create posters about reasons for going to university, and they asked other groups of students to make posters about fashion at university. These instructions implicitly led the students toward certain group norms. Those told to focus on reasons naturally made posters dominated by words, and those who were directed towards thinking about fashion created posters populated largely by images. In the second phase of the study, which came 3 hours later, the same participants created a leaflet to advertise the university, a task that could be accomplished equally well with words as well as with pictures. This time, some of the students worked in groups, whereas others made the leaflet on their own. Here, the researchers were interested in whether this creative task would be shaped by the group norm that had been established in the earlier phase, and it was. When working in a group, participants' creations were generally in line with the group norm that had been established during the poster-making project, whether it centered on images or on words. But when working individually, however, participants typically departed from the norm of the group they had previously belonged to. Such findings and those of similar studies support the claim that the nature of people's creative activity depends on group norms. Evidence that social identification shapes creativity might suggest that groups simply stimulate convergent thinking and conformity. Indeed, back in the 1970s, Irving Yannis of Yale University proposed that a desire to conform to the group leads to a lack of critical thinking and faulty decision-making, a phenomenon called groupthink that he considered the antithesis of creativity. But although group dynamics can sometimes be stifling or even worse, they do not inevitably produce irrational choices or unthinking support of the group's ideas. For one thing, group standards shape only one facet of a person's creativity. Cubist painters, for instance, may use abstract geometric figures in line with the customs of Cubism, but their artwork is likely to diverge on other dimensions, for example, in its use of certain colors or themes that are not restrained by the Cubist style. In addition, far from repressing new ideas, collaborative discussions with friends or colleagues or peers can foster them. As the late psychologist Vera John Steiner of the University of New Mexico noted in her 2000 book called Creative Collaboration, small groups such as the Beatles or Bauhaus or the Bloomsbury Group, for instance, routinely spearhead innovation by bouncing ideas off one another as they look for new ways to tackle artistic, theoretical, and practical problems. What is more, solidarity and conformity are essential for creative movements to progress because they allow people to cohere around a shared enterprise. In a study published in 2006, Haslam, Adarves-Yorno, and Postmes explored this idea by asking small groups of college students to participate in a mock planning process for building an innovative municipal childcare center. Prior to the study, some of the groups went through a procedure that instilled a strong sense of shared social identity, whereas other groups were encouraged to think of themselves as individuals. The groups then met 3 times over an hour and a half to discuss this fictitious project, which encountered mounting difficulties. First, labor costs increased, and then an environmental impact study was needed. Next, they learned that the children's sandbox had traces of toxic elements. Parents were threatening to sue, and officials were holding up building approval. The groups that had initially developed a shared social identity stayed upbeat about the project and continued to support it even as it ran into more and more trouble. On the other hand, those coaxed to see themselves as individuals lost their enthusiasm for the child care center and increasingly argued to abort the project as time went on. In other words, social, but not personal identity bolstered enthusiasm and encouraged people to stay with the creative task in the face of challenges. More generally, people seem to need a sense of shared social identity to stick to their creativity and to see revolutionary projects whether they're in science, industry, the arts, or politics, to completion. Being solidly committed to the group does not make a person unable to recognize its faults either. Sometimes the opposite appears to be the case. When norms are harmful for a group, it is actually the members who feel most connected to the group who are the most motivated to debate and renegotiate those norms. Psychologists Dominic J. Packer of Lehigh University and Christopher T.H. Miners of Queen's University in Ontario asked students to write an opening statement before a meeting in which they were going to discuss alcohol use with their peers who tended to party. The researchers found that the more the participants identified with the group, the more their statements involved creative challenges to that group norm, possibly because those high identifiers felt the greatest responsibility to the group or the most able to effect a transformation. Either way, the research shows that engagement with groups can help stimulate creative ideas for change. Groups also play a vital role in the appreciation of groundbreaking achievements. Without tapping into group identity, innovative artists, writers, and scientists may well go unrecognized. In his lifetime, Vincent van Gogh could find hardly anyone to buy his unusual paintings. His work garnered attention only when, after his death, a circle of artists, the post-impressionists, saw his paintings as indicative of a distinctive style that they wanted to emulate in their own work. Similarly, in 1961, the computational models of then graduate student Yoshisuke Ueda were initially barred from publication by his supervisor at Kyoto University because they were seen as too avant-garde. But once a community of scientists had formed who appreciated Ueda's work, however, his theories transformed the newly emerging field of chaos theory. People are far more likely to support a creative project or endeavor if its instigator is a member of their group. Such insider status helps to dispel the uncertainty that new products introduce when they disrupt the status quo. Insiders and organizations are typically antagonistic towards outsiders' contributions, and people often display ethnocentric bias when judging artistic creativity. In the performing arts, judges may preferentially bestow accolades on citizens of their own country, for instance. Both the US Oscars and the British Academy of Film and Television Arts, or BAFTA, awards are meant to judge the objective quality of films. But psychologist Nicholas Steffens and his colleagues at the University of Queensland in Australia found that since 1968, US actors and actresses have received about 80% of the Oscars for Best Actor and Best Actress, but less than half of the BAFTA awards for the same categories. At the same time, British performers have received nearly half the BAFTA awards for Best Actor or Actress, but just over 10% of the corresponding Oscars. So experiments confirm that people's perceptions of creativity depend on whether the creator is one of us or one of them. In one study published in 2008, Haslam, Adarves-Yorno, and Postmes asked 50 people from the UK to evaluate suggestions about the future format of a television show that they said had come from a British website. They told another 50 participants that the same ideas had come from a Dutch website. In part 2 of the study, they asked 125 British students to evaluate the works of art that they attributed to either British or Dutch college students. In both cases, participants who thought their fellow Brits, their in-group, had authored the products in question, judged them to be significantly more creative than did those told that Dutch citizens had generated the same items. What people actually mean by creativity and how they measure it and how they reward it also depends on cultural identity. Psychologists Susanna Palitz, now at the University of Maryland, and Kai-Ping Peng of the University of California at Berkeley conducted a survey that included more than 300 students from China and the US to find out what they thought made certain products creative. They tested 2 very different kinds of products, a course textbook and a meal cooked by a friend. They found that American students' judgments of creativity were swayed more by the perceived appropriateness of a product, whether it was in some sense good, whereas the judgments of the Chinese students were based more on whether the product was something that they personally desired. The tendency for creativity judgments to reflect our social identities also explains some gender bias. Psychologist Thomas Morton and his colleagues at the University of Exeter in England reported that male scientists viewed theories explaining how men were superior to women to be better and more creative than those arguing that women were superior to men. This pattern was reversed for female scientists. Both groups also believed that the creative research that supported their own identity-based preferences was deserving of more research funding. Good creators have a strong sense of their audience and gear their solutions or products to the perceived needs and values of a particular group. Even when work is inspired by the need to separate from a group, successful creators are familiar with the group they wish to deviate from. For example, in the 1970s, punk rock bands such as the Sex Pistols wanted to break away from mainstream popular music. Sid Vicious, the Sex Pistols bassist, called on people to undermine the establishment's pompous authority, reject their moral standards, make anarchy and disorder your trademarks. Ironically, then, the musical establishment of the time gave his band a particular creative force, the desire to rebel, as well as a specific trajectory, something specific to move away from, and appeal for those disaffected with mainstream popular music. As with other successful creative efforts, the Sex Pistols' attempts to break the mold were not exactly random and revolutionary. As members of groups, our creative behavior and our evaluations of others' innovations reflect a desire to extend the values of those groups. To be celebrated rather than vilified, innovators need to know the norms they are departing from. Eventually, they also need an audience willing to embrace the new ways of seeing or behaving that's made possible by their work. To succeed, therefore, creative endeavors must transform communities. These newly formed audiences then drive the cultural change that novel endeavors spark. Pablo Picasso once said, "Disciples be damned. It's only the masters that matter, those who create." Yet, as the curators of a major exhibition at London's National Gallery noted, Picasso's own work owed much to earlier modes of painting that he eventually rejected. And without admirers, his work would have had little influence on society. His work was not about laboring on his own to create everything anew. Rather, as Welsh painter Ossie Rhys Osmond put it in a review of the exhibition, it was a collaborative exercise in reinventing the familiar. We should still study and celebrate the creative genius of individuals. Nevertheless, we need to recognize that the psychology of creativity also involves the groups in which creators develop their work, whose boundaries they seek to extend, and through which they have their sway. "I Did It My Way" may be an appealing anthem for great creators, but as with Frank Sinatra, their success generally also requires promoters, producers, a pack of peers, and an approving public.